The meat grinder created by the Ukrainians crushed and burned Russian troops in the direction of Pokrovski. The drones worked to explode over the soldiers who tried to approach, passing through a funnel of death that piled up corpses. The men from Moskva had to walk along trails where dozens of their own lay fallen in twisted, rotting, or shattered forms. Some acted desperately, trying to jump over the trap using the dead, while others fought as they watched drones fall on their friends. All this for the conquest of a village with only a few dozen houses. This is the battle for Novotoretsk, a community in the middle of nowhere that would become everything in the short lives of some soldiers in the war. A soldier must know that when entering the war, death is a possible outcome of being taken out of the conflict. There are other ways to return home besides in a coffin, especially in the conflict in Ukraine. That is one of the most certain outcomes, and if you're lucky, there will still be a body for the family to mourn. The fatality rate of the conflict, especially after drones became so common, has increased absurdly. And in a very specific place near the village of Novotoretsk in Donetsk, it became proof of that. The meat grinder was active in a strategy set up by the Ukrainians. At that time, the Russians were advancing, Ukrainian casualties were high, and territories were lost. With so much shelling and the advance of Moscow's infantry, those were difficult times. In Kiev, already struggling to replenish its forces, they had to deal with the Russians, sending an almost endless number of men to the front. Russia was now recruiting not only in its own country, but all over the world, and hundreds of them were heading toward the new target. They were heading to Pokrovsk, destroying villages, taking more land, and surrounding the city. By mid-2025, they had made rapid progress in the generation. A strong Ukrainian response filmed one of the few territorial gains by Kiev at that time. Nearby, there was a meat grinder filmed and recorded. Novotoretsk, a village of just over 500 inhabitants before the war. Novotoretsk was just another village in the path of the Russians as they advanced toward Pokrovsk, the main focus of the fighting in 2024 and 2025. Most villagers had left long ago. In other times, maybe during World War II, the place wouldn't even be mentioned. Its name would be forgotten in the conflict. But in 2025, only the Ukrainian soldiers remained in the Russians' path, and yet another village would fall under the regime. A record of the route from Moscow to Donetsk. The men from Kiev were watched by drones when they made the mistake of gathering together. Moscow's artillery turned them into a cruel example so that the rest of the troops would have the good sense not to expose themselves in that way. If it wasn't the artillery, it was the high-explosive aerial bombs calmly traveling through the skies before unleashing death on the Ukrainians. Surviving the impact of a high-explosive aerial bomb was nothing. The defenses of a trench were practically wiped out by the impact of one of those bombs. A half-ton bomb carrying 200 to 300 kg of high explosives killed everything within a 50-meter radius and sent shrapnel over 200 meters away. The crater, up to 4 meters deep, was capable of tearing apart the bodies of soldiers hiding in cellars or shelters in the trenches. Drones, kamikazes served as witnesses to the destruction over Novotoretsk while searching for Ukrainians who were not dead. The low flights of the Su-25S were another threat. Their support for the Russian infantry gave the soldiers an opportunity to advance. Putin's men boarded their armored vehicles under orders for another assault toward Novotoretsk. The objective was to reach the village. Even though they had to face the challenge of the defenses, armored vehicles began to advance along the roads. Ukraine's 33rd Mechanized Brigade waited for the enemies to approach one of the simple defenses that had been causing so much trouble for the Russians. becoming a headache for the commanders, death for the soldiers, and despair for the families. The Russian vehicles began to explode near an area that had been dug out by the Ukrainians and later flooded by rain and nearby rivers. The first one exploded before reaching that difficult crossing, and the others met the same fate with some violent explosions. Because of the mines left around the only bridge that allowed safe passage, the drones disabled what was left of the vehicles. Afterwards, they went looking for the soldiers and the crew who had survived their commander's orders. The Russian persistence continued, with bombs falling on the tree lines in the region. The FABs managed to explode in sequence, and the deadly precision left corpses under the broken trees. The new version of the Russian FABs worked as heavy aerial bombs with autonomous terminal guidance by artificial vision. Before the attack, the system received reference images of the target and, during the approach, the onboard camera compared the real-time video with these models. When there was enough match, the bomb entered its final approach, corrected its trajectory until impact, achieving an error of only a few meters. Unlike pure global positioning system navigation, which is vulnerable to electronic warfare, visual identification proved difficult to interfere with, making the munition resistant to jamming and electronic deception. With this, a single large-caliber high-explosive aerial bomb could destroy entire fortified positions, combining high-explosive power with high precision, even in environments saturated with countermeasures. In this way, when the Russian soldiers reached the tree lines, they found only corpses, which gave them more and more confidence. This led the commanders to send many more of them, without realizing it was a trap. The Ukrainian soldiers, some already wounded, had to endure the explosions in the tree lines. Each arrival was a moment of terror. Every time an explosion sent shrapnel flying through the air. The men crouched down, knowing that the Russians were adjusting the mortar fire, howitzer, or whatever they were using to try to kill them. That was pure terror in the lives of the soldiers. There was no way to fight back. They could only wait and call for help on the radio. The Ukrainians could only defend themselves against the Russian soldiers who came trying to get through the trees to get even closer again. Novotoretsk. In those moments, the rifle was ready. The soldier reacted to the movement in the middle of the woods. His finger pulled the trigger and sometimes released rounds that tore through the air, passing between leaves and branches. The wounded friends tried to protect themselves, fearing that the Russian would counterattack. There was nothing. On the way back, the soldier walked slowly, aiming his rifle until he found the man's corpse who had come there alone. He was just another of Moscow's pedestrians, men sent alone to test the defenses and find gaps. The Russians pushed their drones, flew over a wide anti-tank ditch toward Novotoretsk, hit Ukrainian vehicles, and thus prevented rotations and support for the soldiers further ahead. It was easy to stop vehicles passing through that funnel, but the fact was that the Russians themselves also had to go through there. The soldiers from Moscow proceeded on foot, as was common practice, toward Pokrovski. The men walked alone, in pairs, or in groups of 3, along roads and trails already known to the Ukrainians. Fire broke out among them, taking down the soldiers. The barbed wire obstacles might have seemed like harmless defenses, but they created funnels that directed the soldiers to places where the drones were waiting. Corpses started piling up along the Novotoretsk route. To avoid the wires and the roads, the soldiers tried to go through the green fields, but the drones were there too. Knowing the main trails through the grass, the walkers heard the propellers flying behind them. They turned to see the instrument of their death. Some soldiers still went back to check on their fallen comrades, moving the charred bodies amid the smoke. that only cost them time. The drones came to hunt the tired and wounded men who fell near the corpses of their comrades. Little by little, the Russians approached the anti-tank trench, watching where they should cross, the kamikazes. They took advantage of the moment of indecision for the fatal dive. Both were wounded, but the other still seemed able to escape. Even so, he came back and the two of them, together, decided to use their own equipment on themselves. The small clouds of smoke that appeared marked the death of two more soldiers from Moscow. The lone wanderer sometimes found himself cornered on the road, already smelling the death of what lay ahead. He prepared his Avtomat Kalashnikov rifle after noticing the threat watching him from above. He intended to follow the main path, gaining access to the passage area under the anti-tank ditch. He even aimed his weapon but couldn't shoot. He stood up tired, his face exhausted, his legs weak from the long, intense walk. He aimed the rifle once more, and now the freshly loaded ammunition flew, trying to reach the lenses in the sky, but it was useless. He walked, checking the weapon, and aimed at the spy once again, but his ears caught the howls of death wandering around. There was another demon in the sky, one that flew around the Russian, filming his shots. The one who stopped arming himself darted like an arrow toward the soldier, unafraid of being taken down. The man shrank back, waiting for the impact, still with his finger on the trigger. The explosion tore through his body, separating some parts and twisting others. He became just another pile of flesh that would signal the way for the next ones, and those next ones kept coming more and more. Near the slaughter line, the drone descended on another Russian. He was lucky enough to survive the impact, but his ammunition started to burn. Thanks to a partner, he managed to remove the equipment. The delay allowed other kamikazes to fly in to hunt the pair. They tried to hide in the grass, in the same place where other Russian corpses were lying. Little by little, the kamikazes descended and exploded over their bodies. Bombs were dropped, vehicles were destroyed, and the ground was left scorched next to the corpse. The series of blows defeated the Russians. Drones also dropped explosives on walking soldiers. There was no peace, even at night. The thermal cameras were there to allow a small nocturnal predator to hunt the soldiers. The deaths widened the trail of terror for those who came after. They kept being watched. Their hurried steps put them on the path of the corpses. They tried to speed up when they heard the sound of the drone rushing to take cover in the waters, weakened by the explosions. They held their breath as the AKs vibrated on the men's shoulders and arms, firing under the buzzing of the kamikaze, which whipped at their ears. What happened? The soldiers only started breathing again after the demon finally exploded over the last one in line. The second to last looked back and called. No response. The stupor paralyzed them for a second before the group hurried on again. Then they turned and continued along the trail their comrades had marked with their own bodies. That was war, leaving corpses behind, passing through new corners, human remains. Trying to avoid the rotten smell invading their noses from making them sick or causing more fear. They saw the fallen men, if only they were Ukrainians, but they were their own. Marked with red bands, with their guts exposed to the wind, their flesh devoured by the kamikazes, they hurried each other along, knowing they couldn't stop. Staying with the group was their only chance to survive. Others would be left behind along the way. Prayers were useless to protect the group. It was easier for the soldier to ask that he wouldn't be the next target. Some of them had never seen a Ukrainian during that time of war. They watched the drones, listened to the orchestra of artillery exploding in the background. The human remains were rotting, remains of soldiers who had only seen something from the enemy that came from the skies. There was no winter cold to preserve the bodies. They decomposed before the soldiers' eyes, losing the faces that were once recognized by their families. They were lying in all sorts of ways, almost none appearing to be at peaceful rest, almost all bearing marks of terror, of an eternal hunger caused after intense pain. More of these men were hit. On the way, death traveled close to Pokrovsk and made its rounds rather persistently near Novotoretsk. Explosions accompanied the entire route of the solo runners, but the luckiest managed to get through some parts without being chased by drones. The forest wasn't a refuge. The open field made slaughter easy. The taste of every bomb was death or a wound that would make a man groan without hope of being saved. There was no one who could get them out of there without being shot down. Some finally saw the anti-tank ditch mentioned by the commanders, but died before crossing it. Those who reached the ditch didn't have time to jump to the other side. The drones were scanning the perimeter. When the wounded soldier tried to help his comrade, the bombing drone dropped the grenade on both of them, letting them die together, just as they had walked. More of these men began to die in that hole. Some jumped to escape the eyes of the drones. On the road, the only choice was a new place to die. Corpses piled up in a mass grave which was meant to block the passage of tanks. It was becoming a grave for the Rufos. For their commanders, the only strategy was to send more soldiers. The kamikazes found these men. They blew themselves up on them, leaving the bodies resting on land that would soon see more flesh sent from Moscow. They arrived tense, but walked according to the orders they had received, seeing the bodies of their comrades still fresh, and the explosives simply detonated on them. They could be accompanied or not. Each man received his share of Ukrainian revenge. There was nowhere to hide. They came down the road, passed through the open field, and piled up in the funnel of death. It was terrifying to watch the evil flights choosing their prey. As long as there was power available, the drones flew, trying to find more victims. The war showed no mercy. By that time, people of different nationalities were already dying there. It wasn't just Ukrainians facing death, and the drones didn't discriminate either. In the combat zone, the Ukrainians had already retreated from the area. So whatever passed through there would die, no one would collect the bodies, the earth would consume them, and history would forget them. Maybe only the animals abandoned in the war would find any use for the flesh ground up by the Ukrainians. There was no hunger for a clever animal. There was a saying that you never wondered why there were no skinny cats and dogs in Ukraine. Sometimes the Ukrainians would let a group happily leave the pit, relieved to be able to continue on their way. Then the bomb would fall on them, leaving their bodies burned. Anyone who survived and thought they could escape was very much mistaken. It wasn't the right time. The smoke was still in the air. When more of them arrived, bringing all the heavy equipment, it was hard to move around with so much stuff. Stepping on bodies, the bomb fell on them and threw them to the ground. The bomb fell trying to set a corpse on fire. One of them jumped onto the bodies piled up in the pit, trying to hide among them, but the kamikaze went after him. He became another twisted, blackened mass. Sometimes, a traumatized man, confused by the explosions and the air corrupted by death, would simply stand there until he received the final blow. Others abandoned their equipment and helped each other to escape the pit, but the bombs released some kind of gas. He got out of the pit seeing all the death, picked up his things tired, but the kamikaze was already watching him. His name was written in the death notebook. He waited for his exhausted colleague to climb up, but the man struggled. The drone appeared right then. Watching quickly, the Russian froze, hoping that some artificial intelligence wouldn't recognize him as a target. Whoever was behind that camera saw very well and positioned the drone behind him. The Russian heard the buzzing, felt the propeller wind on his neck, and said his final prayers. The drone exploded on his back to send him straight into the ditch. He fell in flames in front of his comrade. Frightened, the other saw the man groaning his last words. He managed to gather strength to help him. The drone with his name arrived late. Death can take its time. However, on its visit, it forgets no one. The Rus got his gunpowder and slept on the ground in Ukraine beside a Moscow soldier amid the chaos. To carry out the orders, the soldiers were sent on motorcycles. A pair was found on one of those motorcycles. They heard the buzzing of the drone following them along the dirt road, with his comrade begging to go faster. The last sound he heard from him was a scream of pain. When the explosion destroyed the bodies and the vehicle, the charred remains were left on the ground. Filmed by the next drone that showed up to check if everyone was dead, more of them were found by the drones, still on the road. They exploded, like nearly everyone else on the route. The many deaths affected one Russian's common sense. He sped across the open field, kept control of the motorcycle over the rough terrain, and aimed for the ditch he needed to cross. He knew that taking the road route would only make him another dead man among so many corpses. He gripped the handlebars, sweating in his gloves, as the motorcycle leaped over the obstacle. He would then fall and crash onto the ground, where he lay with his body broken until he died. The Ukrainians didn't care about blowing him up. After repeated insistence, the Ukrainians retreated toward Pokrovski to survive. Some Russians went through the meat grinder, seeing all the flesh incinerated, ground up, shredded, and in so many other ways that war presented. They filmed it to show their colleagues and the unbelievers and madmen who were still spreading the idea of an easy campaign. But stupid people exist everywhere, and even a fact doesn't change the mind of an imbecile. Much less someone who, blinded by ideology, doesn't care about all those corpses. But would they easily trade all those lives for the death of just one person who disagrees with them? But the Russian soldier made a point of filming the tragedy of his comrades before heading to his own. The group entered Novotoretsk walking with relief, but there were already soldiers from the Casualties battalion waiting. The rifle hidden inside the house fired at a small column formed by the Russian squad, already leaving several of them down. And rocket-propelled grenade exploded over another one. Anyone hiding among the houses was killed. During the drone chase, some of these wounded soldiers, leaning on their rifles, tried to hide. It was useless. The Casualties battalion was chasing them all over the village. They had already gone through the grinder, but the flesh kept being crushed. Even so, they kept dying under the small columns of smoke. Lives disappeared, but even so, meter by meter, they kept going. They just had to follow the trail of corpses to find their fate, following orders, conquering yet another village in the name of Moscow. They just had to remember that each corpse was a spent drone and one less drone in the sky, giving the Russian a chance to advance. There were many Russian soldiers. What about them, soldier? The Russians kept bombing the village. They needed to get through there. That was an intense conflict zone, where the fighting had already led to a disastrous campaign towards Dobropia. Months earlier, that disaster had affected the pride of some commanders. Their multiple rocket launchers unleashed fury on the Ukrainians, who were still trying to defend the village and surrounding areas. But bombs fell. Shortly after, the village filled with smoke, marking the end of the Ukrainian defenses. It was a victory, but someone in Russia was not pleased. Lieutenant General Sukarab Akhmedov, who was responsible for the region, was removed from command. Not even 2 months later, amid so many false reports, someone above him must have seen it as the Novotoretsk, a village of 520 inhabitants that had been captured in October 2001 was taken. The Russian patrols recorded more than 200 corpses. Just one of the Ukrainian death funnels had 27 corpses of Moscow soldiers in a single footage, at least the equivalent in Russian soldiers. 2/5 of the original population of the village died. Recorded on camera, about 200 deaths documented by the cameras, not counting the bodies that were. There was no record of the wounded who were unable to fight, the amputees, the rescued, all this for a small piece of land. So many men forgotten in their efforts because of a village that, in other wars, wouldn't even have been recorded in history. So many families asking for their loved ones, searching for missing relatives whom even the Moscow armed forces had no record of. That was seen as a Russian victory, which they shared on social media. Something that wouldn't even be worthy of a footnote in a history book in other times, but now it was just another one of the Russian historical notes of yet another village, just a few dozen houses that was conquered, turned into ruins, and where corpses filled the streets and the rubble.